Hi there, I'm John from sandboxranch.com, and today we're going to make some more custom banks. I've now done quite a few production runs of these banks, and I'm starting to get things down, really optimizing the design, optimizing the process, optimizing the bits, and ultimately optimizing the CNC machine. Part of that means that I'm actually getting another CNC machine to increase production and improve the quality of what I produce here in the shop. Now, one of the questions I often get from customers is, what does it matter if something's kiln dried or not? And especially for something this small. So here's one of the banks made in this production run. And it's got the black oxide screws. And you say, well, kiln dried or not, what's the difference? Because these things are relatively small, I don't think there actually would be much of a difference if it was actually done that way. We could probably use just raw wood, produce these, ship these out, and maybe you start to have problems maybe 6 months to a year down the road. What I found for kiln dried lumber is that the major advantage to it is there's no bugs all over it. Bugs tend to like living in wood, on wood, all around wood, chew through wood. Sometimes you could actually put your ear against some slabs and you actually hear chomping. And that's the worms eating through the wood. And I've had that here in the shop, you know, with some people drop off some lumber that they want me to flatten with my CNC router. And if you're very, very quiet, sometimes you can hear chomp, 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 chomp. And right away, they might say it's kiln dried. It's definitely not kiln dried because those bugs would be dead if it was actually kiln dried. The other advantage to kiln drying, which again is a lesser effect, is that it gets rid of a lot of the warping that would be here drying out. What happens with wood is that as it dries, you have different densities in the wood. So one section of the wood, let's say you have a piece of lumber like this long, let's say this is like 12 feet. So over here might be, I don't know, 30% humidity. This might be 5% humidity because it was in the sun. This could have been, you know, in the ground, what have you. And those humidity variations cause the material to start to warp on you. Now what the kiln drying does, it evens out the humidity. And by doing that, it makes it actually, all the warping sort of goes away to a certain extent. And once that happens, you can actually produce something with it. And generally what happens is the humidity is even across the board. Now in this case here, this is why I say it's not that much of a significance. These things are very, very small. So I would probably guess that if this was raw wood, the humidity on this would be about the same all the way across. It wouldn't really make much of a difference. But another thing to keep in mind is you're also dropping the humidity in the wood, which makes it a lot lighter as well. If you ever cut a live tree, you'll notice that it's really, really heavy compared to some of the logs that you might grab, you know, they were sitting in the garage for a couple years. So we're getting rid of that water, which reduces the weight of the banks. And the other nice thing about it is that when it comes to finishing, you don't have all those resins and glues and all the other stuff in the wood that would actually interfere with the tongue oil and that kind of stuff. So there's a lot of advantages to it. So let's go ahead and start making some banks. So as you can see here, what I'm doing is chopping down the larger pieces of lumber that are rough sawn into smaller little pieces, which will then be laminated. This adds a lot of strength to the overall design and a lot more clean aesthetics to it as well. Here I'm using the router to clean off all the surface, make them all parallel and make them all flat. Now this is a very important step because it means that when I glue everything together, all the joints are perfect. And that's something, you know, that I'm astonished at how well the CNC actually acts as a jointer. It probably is a better jointer than an actual jointer because everything is completely, utterly flat and parallel. And it's not something you do with a power tool at all. You can also see the surface is really, really cleaned up. So what we saw here was red oak. The reason why I'm using red oak for the initial stage of these banks, because it's a very, very hard wood. It's a very dry wood, actually, after it's kiln dried. And it's actually very easy to work with for some odd reason. Softwoods are really nice to sand and that kind of stuff, but this is incredibly hard, but it seems to cut really, really well with the CNC machine. Now here we have one of the boards. So you can see it's rough sawn. You have some blade marks, you have some stuff. So after I cut these out with the table saw, I do the laminating process, and I flatten it, and I do all these kind of things to it, and you end up with something like this. And of course, you can see, if you look very, very carefully, you can see the lines. You can definitely tell by the edge. So here, there's a line going all the way across. But once you look at it, It's a very clean surface, and it's incredibly, like this is relatively heavy. This is about maybe 6-7 pounds. So it definitely has some weight to it. And after you do make the banks, what happens is you clear out most of it. And that's why having a hard wood is very, very important, because let's say this was like a soft wood, let's say pine. If I were to do this on pine, you probably wouldn't visually be able to tell the difference. It'd be a lot more cost effective to produce these banks if I use that material. But the problem is the wall thickness here is so thin, relatively speaking, that if this fell on the ground and it was pine, it would be broken all over the place. Now the nice thing about the way I design these banks is that you have a solid back on here, which gives it a lot of strength and rigidity. But you also have something on the front that's screwed in multiple places, which also adds a lot of rigidity. Because you have to keep in mind, the center of this here, I'd say about this deep, actually has nothing in it. It's just air. And that's where you're putting your coins. Now this is definitely real wood. It's not fake wood. And you can tell because in this production run, I discovered a fault in the wood. So these ones here are not finished, obviously. And you can see here, get the angle right so it's easier to see. You can see here, it starts to break on you. Now this is not the bit breaking it, it's actually the wood. So what happened is there was a split in the wood, and as I was producing it with the router found the split and exaggerated the split and took the split off, and you can see the result here. So if this was a man-made material, for instance, we can make these things out of corian, we can make them out of literally anything. Corian is compressed acrylic, so if we were to make these banks out of corian, we wouldn't have that issue because it's a man-made product which is consistent across the whole material. So I've played with a lot of different ways to glue these, different kinds of glue. It might always look like I'm using the same bottle, but I'm actually filling it up with different kinds of glue to see what results produce the best. The biggest change in this production run that I realized was that I need to make sure the laminated board is actually straight all the way across. I did a production run before this one here, and I completely forgot about that. And as a result, I ended up wasting quite a bit of wood because the result of the slab was going upwards or downwards. It wasn't totally flat. You can see all the edges, how they all sort of match, like they all sort of meet each other on the left side there. And then after the glue is dried, I have glue seeping on the top and I have glue seeping in the bottom. So there's glue all over the place, and I can either try to sand it off or I just use the router that made all these little pieces perfectly, and it does a wonderful job of that. So it's now just not only flattening it, but cleaning up the surface of all the glue. This is the bottom side that you can really see a lot of glue everywhere. And although these boards are not totally square, they're pretty accurate. One of the biggest differences that I've realized throughout the whole production process of these banks, because I've been prototyping just a ton of banks on red oak, and the biggest difference I've noticed is you're actually using custom bits. My bits are actually gone now for sharpening, so I don't have any. I think I actually have one here. This is a down cut. So these are custom bits that I get manufactured actually for these banks. Now they're definitely very expensive, but they produce a very, very sharp result. And the other nice thing is I could send them back to the factory because they're locally made, and they can actually resharpen them. So the bits might cost a lot more money up front, but the advantage is that once they do a couple of these banks, each bit probably lasts about 30 banks at most. After that, they start to get dull. And I could tell that right away because while the bit is working into the wood, you can actually hear the machine running harder. The spindle, the top part of the machine, is actually running harder, and you actually see the wood sort of reacting differently. It's sort of like having a very sharp knife versus a dull knife. If you're cutting, let's say, tomatoes with a very sharp knife, you have a very clean edge all along. And if you try to do it with a dull one, you end up squishing the tomato. It's basically the same stuff with this red oak. As you're carving into it, if you have a very sharp bit, you have a very clean edge, as you see here. And as it dulls out, you'll notice this kind of stuff here. Now definitely when I produce a lot of these banks, I want to have a nice sharp edge. And the advantage to that is I don't have to sand all this stuff afterwards, which saves a lot of labor and actually keeps the price down for the sandbox ranch banks. So just something to keep in mind. Different species have different requirements. So if I was doing these things out of softwood, for instance, the bits that I use will last pretty much forever. But because this is a very hard wood, I have to produce maybe 20, 30 banks, and then after that they start to go down. Got to get them sharpened, and thus the cycle continues. In this production run here, I'm using the custom bits that I had created for me for this application. And using custom bits is very expensive, but you can already see the edge quality is incredibly sharp. I don't have any sort of pieces of wood coming off the top or the bottom or any sort of shattering, or no issues at all. It's just amazing. And what I really enjoy about that process here is that it means that I don't have to do any sanding anywhere on these banks after they're done being produced. Now, of course, this is a prototype production run, so there's a couple of design issues that I need to fix on these to make sure that everything comes out a lot cleaner than it is. But those things are minor little things that I'll be going bank by bank and letter by letter, and then just fixing it on the design file. And as mentioned, this is probably the last time I'll be using this machine to do this. This machine has been absolutely amazing for me to produce it to this point, but I definitely need a machine that's a lot more rigid and a lot more capable, and definitely with a tool changer. Right here, I'm using 2 bits, and the reason I'm only using 2 bits is because I have to manually change the bit after the first bit does the carving, the other bit does the cleanup, and it's quite a process to do that. And I actually screwed up on this production run because I accidentally re-zeroed my X, Y, and Z while I was doing this. I have a little handheld sort of wizard that I can use for this while monitoring, so I could stop or pause or do whatever I need to do while the production run is happening. And for some odd reason, I saw a button that I didn't realize was there before. I didn't know what it did, so I pressed it. And by, my luck, when I pressed that button, it re-zeroed everything, which means that I spent about an hour trying to get everything properly in the right place. Now you'll see the banks look almost 100%. There's a couple of flaws because I had to re-zero it, so nothing's 100% dead on. I might be off, by half a millimeter, but I see the result in these banks, and they would definitely be a lot nicer if they're done properly. Now this is my table router that I made myself. This is a laser cut table, and it just works amazing. I'm astonished by how many things I could do with this table here in the shop, and it's followed me so far into 2 different shops. The other part of the journey for these custom banks has actually been making the front windows. All the banks have an acrylic, transparent by default, but this can be optioned off to different colors, different shades. I definitely want to offer stainless steel with this as well, which would be really, really cool, I think. Although you won't be able to see through it, you can actually hear it as it drops in. Or we can make like slats. There's a ton of stuff we could do here in the shop. But before I do that, I always make them out of MDF, which is this stuff here. And you can tell it's laser cut because you can see the striations on the back. So the reason why I use MDF over acrylic to make these is because the MDF is very, very cost effective. To do this out of MDF, like this here, if I screw it up, it's just about nothing cost-wise. And another nice thing about this MDF is that it's also the same thickness as the acrylic that I use for these banks. So if there's any sort of issues for placing, horizontally, vertically, all that kind of stuff, I could pretty much define everything I need on the MDF, throw this stuff out in the fire pit after it's done, and then once everything's optimized properly, I do the expensive stuff, which can be the polycarbonate or the acrylic. Here what you can see is me laser cutting the front MDFs. Again, MDF is cheaper than acrylics, so this stuff what you want to use for all the prototyping. I'm also doing all the screw holes. Now you'll notice that The next step after this, when I'm assembling the blanks, I'm actually using a drill to drill out all the holes into the wood, which will then mate with the holes that I make here out of the MDF and then later on acrylic. Now there's another step that I want to avoid doing completely. So the new CNC router will actually have a tool changer, which means that one of the tools can actually be a drill bit, which means that the whole process of me manually doing some of these processes is completely gone. The advantage to that is you end up with a lot more precise product, a much more accurate product, which means that, you know, let's say all the screw holes need to be exactly, for some odd reason, let's just say 1 inch deep into the material. It's a lot more accurate to have the machine do that than for me, because the machine will do it 90 degrees parallel downwards. While me with a drill, no matter, you know, how precise I can possibly be, I'll always be a couple of degrees off one way or another. I do have a nice industrial drill press which can do that as well, but if I could do all of this stuff with the wood, with the machine, why would I want to then do it manually like you see here? So there's 2 steps involved. One drill is actually doing all the holes into the wood, and then I take the masking off the acrylic, and then I manually, you know, put in all the screws. Now that step there will stay. There's no way around that. I can't have the machine do that. But me actually going through this stuff, that'll save me about 50% of the time when it comes to making these banks, because now I'm just drilling it in and I'm done. It's gonna just save me a lot of time. And it also means that if I have custom shapes or different sort of idea profiles for these designs, it's a lot more easy for me to optimize the design for the machine than to optimize the design for me actually going through the process of creating these. Now the MDF in this run here was absolutely perfect. I didn't have to do any prototyping of that whatsoever, and that's because of all the prototyping I did with all the other last couple bunches of banks. And the reason why I didn't have as many issues is because now I established a standard, so I know exactly what width, what design I need to go through with any shape. It works, everything just works perfectly now for that process there. You can see to the right, you can see those banks there are actually with tung oil, so they're a lot darker. And you actually see a bit of the shine coming off from the drill, which is kind of neat. Before I go through the show and tell of these bangs that I made in this production run, I just want to show you the difference of what tung oil does. So this is with tung oil. This has 2 coats on it, and this is just the raw banks using the red oak. So they're both red oak. They were both cut with this machine behind me here. Same process, same everything. But you can tell the color is very different. And again, tung oil protects the surface of it, protects it from humidity and mold buildup if you live in an incredibly So I just want to show you the difference before we do the show and tell of the banks. So here's the banks we produced in this production run. There's a whole bunch. I'll show them to you shortly. And here's the same banks, but these are both red oak, but this one here has tung oil, 2 layers applied to it. So you can tell quite a bit of a difference in color. And this is really, I really like the color of this because it really shines literally, but also figuratively. It gives it a lot more warmth. It protects the surface of the banks from mold, mildew, all those kind of things as well, and clears and seals the surface at the same time. Now let's do the show and tell. So here's the P. And again, they all have the black oxide screws, which is the default option for the banks. Here is the K. So these are all still pretty much almost finished prototype versions of these banks. There's a couple of little things I want to improve on all of them, but they all have basically the same idea behind them. So the number one thing I wanted for these banks was that they're very easy for me to mass produce here in the shop. That means they're very cost effective. I could technically make all of these with a bandsaw, but I don't have the time and you probably don't have the money for me to do that kind of work. And of course I run CNCKing.com, so we do custom fabrication day in and day out. So I'm already busy as it is. Now the nice feature about these banks is the top here is open all the way, which means that when you're putting coins in for a child, they don't have to try to line it to something that's exactly the width of the coin or a little bit more give and take. It's very easy to put the coins in and then ask your parents for more coins. And here's the H. And you can always tell the top because the top is the one with the holes and the bottom has no holes. So this production run what I really focused on was improving the amount of space for the coins. So you can really see this in the eye, for instance. So you have a nice thickness here. You have definitely a nice wall thickness here. So again, if this falls on the ground, if you have a nice wall thickness, solid back, and an acrylic front, all screwed together, it's definitely not going to break on you unless you live in a marble house. And here's the L. And I also try as much as I can to increase the space that you have here across the whole design profile. Because again, I want to have banks where you can actually put money in it and not fill it up every 2-3 days with coins just because the bank is too small. And the last one here, U. So as mentioned, this is probably one of the last runs I do with this machine here. I acquired a big Thermwood CNC router, and that's going to be able to produce these banks in a lot faster for me, higher quality, and everything across the board will just be a lot more efficient. So I can make a lot of things that I can't really make properly on this machine will be no problem for the new machine. So if you're looking for custom banks, any size, any shape, any material, any design, and any kind of thing you can think about, we can produce for you here in the shop. Just go to sandboxranch.com and send the contact information there, and we'll go from there.